For centuries, a single piece of linen has divided faith and science. Some call it the face of God, others dismiss it as a clever forgery. Popes have praised it as beyond human artistry, while skeptics branded it myth. But now, the mystery has collided with modern technology. Artificial intelligence has been unleashed on the Shroud of Turin. What it uncovered left scientists stunned, and believers shaken to their core. What AI uncovered in the Shroud of Turin was not a picture, not a stain, but something far stranger. Buried deep in the ancient fibers were hidden patterns, repeating codes, and a geometry that should never exist on a cloth woven centuries ago. Was it a flaw of chance, a miracle of faith, or a message humanity was never meant to decipher? The Shroud of Turin has never been just a relic, it is a riddle that refuses to be solved, a story that refuses to end. Stretching over 14 feet in length and barely 3 feet in width, its herringbone weave shimmers like ripples of frozen light. And upon its fragile surface rests the faintest outline of a man, head to heel, front and back, as though a body once lay there, only to vanish, leaving behind nothing but a ghostly imprint to defy time itself. The wounds etched across the cloth read like a silent narrative carved into fiber. At the wrists, dark marks where nails would pierce. At the feet, a trail of blood-like stains. Along the side, an oval shadow that suggests the thrust of a spear. And faint circles at the scalp, remnants of what looks like a crown of thorns pressed into flesh. The face does not declare itself. It lingers, eyes closed, beard divided, as if caught between life and death. The hair falls in strands that seem to hover just above the weave, as though the cloth and the image were once separated by air. The first recorded appearance of the shroud emerges in 13th century France, where a modest town transformed into both a shrine for believers and a battlefield for skeptics. Pilgrims flocked to witness. Priests carried it in solemn processions. And critics accused the church of fabricating a miracle. The shroud passed through countless hands and households until the House of Savoy brought it to Turin, where in 1578 it began its long vigil, scarred by fire, saved from smoke, carried through chaos, yet never destroyed. Today it lies sealed within a climate-controlled chamber inside the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist, guarded by glass, steel, and silence. Time surrounds it, but certainty never has. No single event shaped its mystery more than a photograph taken in 1898. Lawyer and amateur photographer Secondo Pia set up his lamps and plates in a stifling darkroom, expecting little more than a blur of shadows. But when the negative developed, the world changed. Out of darkness emerged a face, eyes closed, features sharp, cheekbones defined. What the naked eye saw as a faint, ghost-like smear became, on film, a haunting portrait etched with uncanny clarity. The lips emerged with sharp definition, the hair untangled into fine strands, and the crossed hands revealed proportion and form. That photographic reversal was not proof of divinity, but it proved something else. The image behaved with light in a way no brush or pigment ever could. From that moment, the shroud was no longer just a relic of faith. It became a riddle. The chapel gave way to the laboratory. Through the 20th century, the linen endured every tool of modern science. Chemists stripped fibers and tested them with reagents. Microscopes traced its threads. Forensic specialists noted that the blood-like stains were absorbed into the fabric itself, unlike paint resting on a surface. Textile historians measured the weave and found it consistent with looms from the Levant. Pollen researchers uncovered grains linked to the flora of the eastern Mediterranean. Each discovery deepened the mystery rather than solving it. No portrait of Jesus was ever painted here. And yet, the Shroud of Turin remains the most compelling artifact we have, the one that refuses to yield its final answer. Nothing ever proved strong enough to silence the skeptics, yet nothing ever weak enough to dismiss the faithful. The shroud kept doing what it had always done, offering just enough mystery to demand the next experiment. The image refused every explanation of paint or pigment. No binding medium, no brushstrokes, no seepage into the thread. The discoloration clung only to the outermost fibrils, as though the linen had been touched, just once, by light itself. When scientists built depth maps from the intensity of the image, they discovered something astonishing. The shading seemed to correlate with distance, as if the cloth had recorded a three-dimensional body. Where the linen would have rested closer to the nose and forehead, the image darkened. Where it would have stretched farther across the cheeks, the shading lightened. Heat, vapor, chemical burns, every attempt to mimic that gradient came close, but never exact. The shroud remained singular. It outlasted theory after theory, a silent witness that refused to conform. No other figure in history bears the marks of crucifixion in such haunting detail. How could it be anything else? Then came the fiercest test of all, age itself. In 1988, 3 laboratories were handed threads from a single corner of the cloth. In 1988, scientists measured the radiocarbon content and announced a verdict: the shroud dated to somewhere between the 13th and 14th centuries. To many, that seemed final. A medieval origin tied the mystery up in a single sentence. But even the cleanest sentence can conceal a hidden clause. The threads tested came from a corner long exposed to handling, fire, and repair. Textile experts argued that the fibers may have included material from a medieval reweave rather than the original cloth. Others questioned the cleaning process. Could contamination have skewed the results? And could one fragment truly represent an artifact that had endured centuries of smoke, rescue, and human touch? The debate didn't end, it evolved. If the date was right, then the shroud is the greatest medieval forgery ever made. If the date was wrong, the mystery only deepens. Either way, the linen refused to be reduced to a footnote. And so, the shroud entered the modern age still carrying its paradox. An image that behaves like a photographic negative long before photography existed. A surface discoloration without pigment or brushstroke. A depth gradient that hints at three-dimensional information. A dating result that tells us more about methods than about origins. Suspended between reverence and skepticism, it waited for the next voice to enter, not with belief, not with denial, but with discovery. What arrived was not faith or doubt, it was computation. A new way of seeing. A system built to detect patterns too faint for the human eye and too vast for the human mind. The machine did not care about belief. It was not offended by mystery. It was designed to ask a sharper question: what exactly is hidden in this image that we have never measured before? Photography had revealed a face. Chemistry had traced fibers. But what happens when intelligence born from algorithms listens to linen? That is where the controversy of dating re-emerges. The radiocarbon campaign of 1988 was hailed as the moment that would settle the shroud once and for all. Oxford. Zurich. Arizona. 3 laboratories, 1 strict protocol. A fragment cut from a single corner, divided, cleaned, combusted, reduced to graphite, and fed into accelerators that translate isotopes into years. The result? A neat window between 1260 and 1390. The world sighed with relief. Headlines declared the mystery closed. Curators exhaled as though centuries of debate had finally ended. For a moment, the shroud seemed filed away into history, until that very corner became the most scrutinized square of cloth on earth. The fragment came from the lower left corner, the place most likely to have been handled by pilgrims and priests, and the very area repaired after the documented fire of the 16th century. Textile chemist Raymond Rogers examined its fibers and claimed they were not the same as the main body of the cloth. He reported traces of cotton woven into the linen, residues of dye, and chemical signatures that suggested later mending. If true, that corner was not original, and any date derived from it would drift centuries forward. Defenders of the 1988 test countered that the laboratories had rigorously cleaned their samples and verified their consistency. Yet critics replied that repairs can be subtle. A patch seamlessly integrated could escape initial checks while still shifting the radiocarbon signal. Rogers' analysis pointed to yarn cut from the very middle of the radiocarbon sample itself, fibers that seemed, by his account, not ancient linen but something newer. That is where the debate continues to breathe, in the narrow seam between laboratory confidence and lingering caveat. Other approaches have stepped in, not to erase radiocarbon dating but to broaden the frame. Techniques such as wide-angle X-ray scattering, which examines the crystalline order of cellulose in ancient textiles, have in some studies suggested dates that lean earlier than the medieval verdict. Critics warn that humidity, heat, and centuries of storage can distort a signal, making calibration difficult and error margins wide. Supporters answer that no method is flawless, and what ultimately matters is the convergence of evidence across multiple techniques. Even the pollen studies fall into this pattern. Grains from species native to the Levant do not prove origin, but they do hint at exposure or movement through those regions. Combined with analyses of weave patterns and traces of herbs reported by some investigators, these details sketch a portrait that leans toward antiquity without ever locking it in as fact. The deepest complication is access. The shroud is not an artifact freely handed to science, it is a relic under protection. Sampling must be sparing, cautious, almost surgical. That restraint preserves the cloth, but it also magnifies the weight of each chosen fiber. Probability becomes merciless here. A tiny misrepresentation at the sampling site can ripple outward into sweeping conclusions. A handful of threads can be mistaken for a timeline. A fragment from a seam can be read as an entire century. The scientific instinct is to take more samples, spread across a grid, but reverence and conservation set the limits. The custodians guard it, the scientists press to probe it. Between protection and investigation, the debate sharpens. If the 1988 radiocarbon date is entirely correct, then the shroud is a medieval masterpiece of astonishing genius. Yet even then, the mystery remains unsolved, because no known medieval technique can replicate the image's eerie superficiality or its precise three-dimensional mapping. But if that date is flawed, the field reopens, not to certainty, but to a horizon that stretches back into the earliest centuries of the Common Era. That does not prove the cloth once wrapped Jesus of Nazareth. It simply restores the very question belief raises and science tests. Into that unresolved space steps artificial intelligence, an impartial referee that does not care about winning arguments. AI does not cut threads or demand new samples, it touches only the data. It cannot date linen. What it can do is interrogate the image at levels of resolution no eye or lens could reach, pulling structure from noise. It can ask whether intensity patterns match the physics of contact, projection, or some unknown field effect. It can trace how blood-like stains and image areas overlap, testing whether their order hints at process. It can search for symmetries, some visible, others buried deep in the mathematics of the matrix. AI does not replace radiocarbon dating or cellulose scattering. It stands alongside them, insisting that, when, must not eclipse, how. When one method closes the case but the evidence itself refuses to comply, the task is not to take sides, but to design the next experiment. And the shroud, still whispering anomalies, demands exactly that. With the quiet arrival of algorithms, a new chapter opens, technology enters the tomb. For decades, high-resolution photographs of the shroud have existed, multispectral sets capturing ultraviolet fluorescence and infrared response. Yet when those same images are fed into systems designed to extract faint signals, the change is not only in degree, but in kind. Principal component analysis teases variance apart from variance. Convolutional networks hunt for recurring forms. Frequency filters strip away noise to reveal hidden periodicity in the weave. These methods do not invent data, they reorder it until patterns rise above randomness. When those rearrangements first lit the screen, some expected confirmation of what the eye already knew, a face, a torso, hands, stains. Instead, the analysis exposed something far less comfortable, order that resembled neither brushwork, nor stamp, nor transfer. It looked instead like a rule not written by human hand. Earlier 3D simulations had tested the old contact theory. If cloth touched flesh, then contact points should darken, while untouched areas should remain blank. But such mapping inevitably produces distortions, especially across cheeks, shoulders, and fingers. Digital artists draped virtual linens across 3D models, only to find mismatched proportions. When the same cloth was imagined over a shallow relief instead of a full body, the fit improved, but not convincingly. The verdict was clear: contact alone could not explain what the linen preserved. Something more, something like distance mapping, seemed to be at work. Here, artificial intelligence entered, unburdened by devotion or doubt. Treating pixel intensity as a measure of image depth, it found a striking consistency: darker meant nearer, lighter meant farther, across broad regions of the cloth. Such coherence would collapse if painted by hand, however skilled, or if pigment were transferred by pressure, where fibers reveal penetration and directionality absent from the shroud. What AI revealed is an image behaving as if spatial information had been encoded, not with paint, not with mass, but with a process no medieval artisan could have engineered. A presence without weight, written in light and distance. The language around the shroud remains careful for a reason. No one claims the cloth received a projection. No one claims radiation etched an image into linen. The observation is simpler, yet stranger. When advanced systems are asked what kind of order explains the link between brightness and form, the result resembles a mathematical surface, not a painter's stroke. The discoloration rests only in the caps of fibers, to depths measured in microns. It never penetrates the core. The edges soften, blending seamlessly across thread boundaries rather than clogging the weave. Even modern laser experiments, run by independent teams, have failed to reproduce such a delicate, uniform effect without scorching or diffusion. Meanwhile, a graphics lab in upstate New York is preparing something far more radical: a reconstruction, not in theology, but in physics. Their question is blunt: what kind of process can deliver energy so precisely that it alters only the outermost fibers, and does so with gradients that follow distance? When researchers layered different spectral images into the same framework, another anomaly surfaced. A faint symmetry emerged around the face and chest, patterns not explained by folds in the cloth, or by camera error. The symmetry repeated itself across transforms. It survived the removal of obvious noise. It even persisted when randomized controls were tested. Skepticism demands we treat such findings as artifacts until proven otherwise. Curiosity demands we don't dismiss them too quickly. If the shroud were simple contact, chaos should dominate. If it were mere artwork, tool marks should betray it. If it is neither, then we stand before a process not yet within our grasp. AI did not conjure this from nothing. What it found was already there, information hidden in plain sight until machine vision traced its outlines. Beneath the face and torso, new patterns surfaced, ratios repeating across brow, lip, and chin, faint curves echoing ribs and shoulders. A silent geometry woven into linen, waiting centuries to be read. Even the blurred hands carried patterns that could not be explained by the weave itself. The geometry endured across ultraviolet and visible light, surviving every test designed to expose illusions. How could such symmetry hide in fabric for centuries, unseen? Skeptics suggested confirmation bias. After all, networks can find faces in clouds or toast. To avoid that trap, researchers turned to neutral methods like principal component analysis, stripping away assumptions and biases. What emerged was not a portrait at all, but a field, brightness rising and falling as though it obeyed a law rather than the strokes of a brush. If it is a law, what kind could govern cloth in this way? Could linen behave less like a canvas and more like a map of invisible forces? Critics warned of halos or false symmetries born in image processing. But when analysts went back to raw photographs, across decades, with different cameras and filters, the structure remained. Control samples treated with heat or stains produced distortions, but never the same ratios. The conclusion, cautious yet critical, began to take shape. The shroud's image is not singular in existence, but it is singular in form. As if seen, through a glass, darkly, the geometry held firm across light bands. Not a camera trick. Not a weave illusion. Something else. The presence of blood-like stains complicated matters further. Instead of disrupting the geometry, they seemed irrelevant, the ratios continued beneath them, untouched. This implied the stains and the image arose from separate processes. If true, then the mystery is deeper still. Did one event chemically mark the cloth while another etched its strange geometry? Or does this relic preserve two overlapping histories, intertwined yet independent? As theories multiplied, whispers grew louder. If the image resembled a field, perhaps it was born from one. Models of corona discharge, ultraviolet bursts, even electrostatic events have been tested. Yet none explain the shallow, precise coloring, or the way distance itself seems mapped into the fibers. At last, one physicist put it with disarming clarity, we do not yet know the mechanism. This does not behave like an artifact. It behaves like a phenomenon. What kind of force writes order onto linen without tools? Chemical, physical, or something unnamed? That question continues to echo across the scientific world. The shroud exists in two arenas. One is public, where headlines flare with words like miracle or forgery. The other is private, where quiet experiments repeat in silence, and findings circulate only in guarded emails. Within that hidden circle, AI's results spread cautiously. Teams tried adversarial tests, hoping to shatter the geometry, but it held. Others searched for echoes in ancient linens, but none revealed the same resilience. An Italian group described it as spatial intelligence in degradation. An American team called it a decaying signal. Both phrases hint at mystery, not resolution. Do such metaphors move us forward, or simply keep us circling the unknown? Theology responded in predictable tones. Some believers called the pattern a fingerprint of resurrection. Others urged caution, if the image arose once, science cannot replicate it. Faith tolerates uniqueness, science does not. Still, most researchers were less troubled by uniqueness itself than by haste. If claims race ahead of evidence, credibility collapses. The scientific rhythm must remain steady, measure, repeat, publish, invite doubt. But can that rhythm survive in a world ravenous for instant headlines? The Vatican, mindful of centuries of controversy, stayed silent. Custodians know too well that any statement would be weaponized by both believers and skeptics. Better to let the data speak. Meanwhile, in the tech world, AI earned unexpected respect. It did not bless or deny. It did not call miracle or fraud. It measured. It mapped. It demanded more measuring. In its neutrality, AI may be the fairest judge the shroud has ever had. But as answers appeared, new questions multiplied. Does the geometry cluster only around the face and chest? Does it weaken toward the limbs? Does it align with the threads or ignore them? Could advanced microscopy confirm whether every fibril carries the same whisper-thin coloring? Could a new radiocarbon study, blind, multi-region, and beyond dispute, finally silence the dating debate? Or will access forever remain too restricted? And a greater question lingers, what if the shroud is not unique? Could there be cousins waiting in museum vaults or private collections, fabrics marked with faint geometries, distance mapping, or the same fragile coloring? If one cousin emerges, the mystery shifts toward the natural. If none are ever found, then the shroud stands utterly alone, its isolation raising the stakes higher than ever. Which is more unsettling, the possibility that the shroud belongs to a family of hidden cousins scattered across forgotten textiles, or that it stands utterly alone, a singular relic without parallel? If uniqueness prevails, is the cloth a divine gift, a clever deception, or an unsolvable riddle? Speculation drifts first to chemistry. Linen carries cellulose layered with oils, impurities, and the traces of burial spices. A fragile carbohydrate film coats its fibers, a skin vulnerable to oxidation. Perhaps a brief, concentrated burst of energy dehydrated only that outermost layer, yellowing the crowns without touching the cores. If distance controlled the intensity, the image could map itself naturally across the cloth. Yet each candidate falters, ultraviolet burns too deep, heat spreads too broadly, corona discharges stay shallow but blur detail. None can meet all the conditions at once, superficiality, sharp edges, distance gradients, and stability across centuries. Physics proposes other routes. Could electrostatic fields alter the fiber tips while sparing the threads below? Could a plasma event etch outlines with more delicacy than heat or light? Laboratories have tested these ideas, producing fragments of resemblance, but never the whole picture. Each success breaks another condition. Is the puzzle impossible, or have we simply not yet found the right key? What force could burn so shallowly, so precisely, and yet leave the linen intact? Others look backward. Could medieval artisans have stumbled on a photographic trick? Relief sculptures, chemical washes, and sunlight might produce shading that mimics form. But study after study finds no pigment binder, no diffusion of dyes, no penetration of color into the threads. And how, if it were art, could anyone create a negative image with three-dimensional depth centuries before photography? If no known technique fits, what does that absence itself suggest? Bolder theories reach into mystery. Some propose that the shroud records a singular energy event at burial, radiation structured by the body itself. To believers, this whispers of miracle. To scientists, it points to an undefined variable. The challenge is not to prove divinity but to ask, would such an event leave detectable byproducts? If yes, where do we search? If no, does the question move beyond science into philosophy? Another frame comes from information theory. The shroud behaves less like art and more like a signal. Its faint geometry resembles a carrier wave, more record than picture. Compression tests could reveal whether its patterns follow simple laws or balance on fragile complexity. Is the shroud merely a slow decay preserved in linen, or does it hide data we have not yet learned to decode? Could artificial intelligence one day read it not as an image, but as encrypted information stitched into threads? Every stalled investigation must fall in love with questions. The point is not who or when, but how and by what process. The shroud has long trained us to argue about dates and identities, machines now train us to argue about order. What kind of order allows an image to form without pigment, so faint it could be stirred by breath, yet resistant to centuries of light? What kind of order can survive the scrutiny of both ultraviolet and visible wavelengths, while ignoring stains carried by blood through entirely different pathways? Some demand closure, proof of divinity or proof of fraud. But perhaps the deeper lesson of the shroud is this: meaning lies not in the answers it withholds, but in the questions it compels us to keep asking. The sober truth is that the shroud proves neither miracle nor forgery. What it does prove is that its image was formed under rules more intricate than we once believed. That realization itself is a gift. It transforms spectacle into science. It calls physicists to explore the boundaries of energy and matter, chemists to examine fragile carbohydrate layers, and engineers to design tools subtle enough to touch linen without scarring it. It asks custodians to consider, can new non-destructive tests finally settle centuries of debate without harming the relic itself? But with every new question comes humility. What if we cannot reproduce the image for decades, or even centuries? Do we walk away, or do we accept that some mysteries are worth a lifetime of patience? The cloth has survived fire, flood, and insult. It will survive long enough for careful hands to measure, map, and test. Here, artificial intelligence could guide the effort, not as an oracle, but as a planner. It could chart where the geometry is sharpest, where intensity falters, where weave distortions complicate the pattern, and suggest the smallest interventions that move science forward. And yet, the deeper we look, the more unsettling the possibilities become. What if the image is not an accident of chemistry but an intentional design? If order exists, then so does authorship. And authorship invites motives, devotion, deception, or demonstration. A lost medieval technique would disturb. An unknown burst of natural radiation would disturb. A deliberate sign left in linen to haunt centuries would disturb most of all. This is the danger: the closer we press, the more the shroud resists every category we trust. If it has a cause, patient minds will eventually uncover it. But if it does not, if it truly stands outside every known phenomenon, it becomes something unprecedented, a mirror in which believers see a sign, and skeptics see a lesson in human longing. Either way, the work remains worthy. And so the greatest fear is not that the shroud proves too much, but that it proves nothing, while still refusing to be ordinary. Terrifying not because it is supernatural, but because it breaks categories. Scientists on private calls use that very word, terrifying, because the more they study, the less it resembles anything science knows how to classify. Artifact or phenomenon? Tool or law? The shroud forces method itself to bend. It demands a new discipline: measure first, sort later. Accept that the image behaves like a phenomenon without yet naming the phenomenon. Build experiments whose failures matter as much as successes. Publish the negatives with the same passion as the positives, because even absence narrows the path forward. Keep words like miracle and hoax on the bench while energy, oxidation, and superficiality take the field. Force constraints where instinct tempts leaps. And yet, one final terror lingers: what if we were never meant to reduce this at all? What if its power lies not in solution but in defiance? That thought is dangerous, because it can excuse surrender. But it also reveals the shroud's strange authority, the power to confront us with a puzzle that refuses to yield, a relic that may never be solved yet refuses to be dismissed. Perhaps the greatest lesson is not an answer, but the patience to live with a question. For centuries, scientists have tried to make this linen speak the language of the laboratory, to press its fibers into the categories of time and technique. 16th century cloth, 1st century cloth, each test produces data that fits one frame yet refuses another. If the shroud is the residue of an unrepeatable moment, then perhaps our words will always trail behind its reality. But this is not defeat. It is an invitation, a freedom for young scientists to try without the burden of closure, to explore without the illusion of finality. That humility is its true gift. The shroud has forced science to speak to faith without shouting, and faith to honor measurement without fear. It has been called relic, hoax, icon, miracle, yet it now also stands as a dataset, a mirror where even artificial intelligence bowed, admitting its own limits. The machine did not solve the mystery, it only confirmed the strangeness. Shallow penetration without pigment. Geometry without brushstroke. Intensity mapping to distance with no known hand behind it. It refused to date the cloth. It refused to prove theology. Instead, it issued a challenge: if this is an artifact, show the tool. If it is a phenomenon, show the law. There is order here, an order beyond our explanation. Not terrifying, but beautiful. It keeps the door open, inviting young minds, fresh experiments, and reverence for truth itself. So what do you see in that order? Which constraint would you test first? If you believe mysteries deserve patience and care, stay with us. Because the next artifact, the next light, may finally reveal how a single piece of linen captured a moment beyond our reach.